My boss humiliated me in every meeting for 4 years, and then one night, she appeared at my door. It was almost midnight when I heard the knock. The kind that doesn't belong to a stranger and doesn't quite belong to a friend either. I opened the door still in yesterday's shirt, and there she was under the porch light, one hand braced against the frame, the other wrapped around the red leather folder every engineer at Corliss Group knew and feared. Headlights slid past behind her. I stood there in the cold, hands still on the latch, and for the first time since I'd known her, I had no idea what she wanted. My name is Aaron Sutton. I'm 35 years old, and I've spent most of my adult life doing the kind of work most people never think about until it fails. I'm a structural engineer, a project engineer now, at a firm called Corliss Group in Pittsburgh. I live alone in a rented house on a quiet street, on a block where the maples are older than most of the houses, in a place with a porch light that flickers if you don't jiggle the switch just right. I've been divorced for 4 years. No kids. Just me. A drafting table I don't really need anymore since everything lives on a screen now, and a coffee maker older than half the engineers on my team. I wasn't always the guy in the back row taking notes and keeping his opinions to himself. 10 years ago, I was a design lead at a firm called Bramwell & Cole, out in Philadelphia, and I was good at it. Genuinely good. I'd worked my way up from a kid with a mechanical pencil and a chip on his shoulder to a man whose signature meant something on a set of construction drawings. People used to ask me to double-check their calculations before they'd send anything out the door. That was a different life. And then one project, one bridge, took nearly all of it away in the space of about 8 months. I don't like to start there. I'll get to it, because you can't understand anything that happened at my front door without understanding what happened before it. For now, all you need to know is that I lost the firm. I lost the reputation I'd spent a decade building, and not long after, I lost my marriage too. My ex-wife's name is Vanessa. She's 2 years younger than me, sharp, ambitious, the kind of person who reads a room before she's finished walking into it. We'll get to her. We'll get to all of it. So I packed up what was left, moved 2 states over to Pittsburgh, and took a job 2 rungs down the ladder from where I used to stand. I told myself that was fine. Better to disappear on purpose than to be pushed out again by people who used to respect you. I kept my head down. I did clean, careful work. I didn't ask for attention, and for the most part I didn't get any. Except from her. Elena Cross was my director at Corliss. 34 years old. Sharp in a way that made people straighten their posture the second she walked into a room. The kind of sharp that isn't loud about itself. She ran design review like a courtroom, and I was, for reasons I didn't understand at the time, her favorite defendant. People at Corliss had a saying, half joke and half warning. You don't want your work in Elena's red folder. Mine lived there. Every submission came back with more red ink on it than black. She'd circle a load calculation twice, underline a connection detail, write a margin note so precise it somehow still managed to feel personal. In every review, my drawings came back looking less like engineering and more like something she'd taken apart just to see what I was made of. I told myself that was simply how it was going to be for me now. I'd already stopped expecting anyone to see me clearly a long time before I ever met her. It's easier to disappear on purpose than to be pushed out again. And if disappearing meant absorbing 4 years of one woman's relentless scrutiny without complaint, without pushing back, without asking why, I figured that was a fair enough trade for staying employed and staying invisible. What I didn't notice back then, what I only understand now, with everything I know sitting behind me like a light finally switched on in a dark hallway, is a pattern that should have told me something years earlier. Every single time Elena tore into my work in front of the team, the exact thing she flagged turned out, weeks or months later, to be the exact thing that quietly got someone else's project killed in a budget review, or someone else's name pulled off a roster during a slow season. Never mine. Mine always survived those seasons, clean, untouched, while people around me disappeared one by one. I used to think that was luck. I know now it wasn't luck at all. The trouble started, as these things usually do, with a name nobody on our floor wanted to hear said out loud. Draymore. Draymore was a national engineering conglomerate. The kind of company that bought smaller firms the way other companies bought office furniture, without much ceremony. In the spring, word came down that they'd acquired Corliss Group outright. With the acquisition came a phrase that made every engineer on our floor go quiet whenever someone said it in the hallway. Transition review. Nobody used the word layoffs. Nobody had to. We all understood exactly what a transition review meant. Somebody was going to lose their name off the roster, and it wasn't going to be gentle about it. I expected, given 4 years of history, that Elena would be first in line to point at the man with the bridge failure in his file. Instead, she got harder. Not crueler exactly, just harder. In a way I couldn't fully explain and didn't try very hard to understand at the time. She started making me redo submittals 3 separate times instead of the usual 2. She'd sit across the conference table and make me walk through every number out loud, in front of the whole team, as if daring someone from Draymore to find a hole in my math before it ever reached their desks. "Do it again," she said one evening, sliding the folder back across the table without even looking up from it. "If they come for you, I want the numbers to speak louder than you can." I heard a threat in that sentence. I carried it home with me that night and turned it over for hours, certain she was sharpening the exact axe that would eventually fall on my neck the moment Draymore asked her for a recommendation. I know now it was a shield. I just didn't have the eyes to see it that way yet. Not after everything Bramwell and Cole had already taught me about how quickly people in charge could turn on you. There were other things too. Small things you notice individually and dismiss, but that add up quietly if you let them sit long enough. She started staying late on the exact nights I stayed late. Always with some unrelated reason. A report she was finishing. A call with the West Coast office that somehow always ran until 9. I'd walk past her office at 8, at 9 o'clock, and there she'd be. Light on, door open, like she'd simply decided to keep my hours without ever once saying so. One night, she appeared at my desk, holding a paper bag from the sandwich place 2 blocks over, and set it down without a word, already turning to leave. "You skipped lunch again," she said, not as a question, already halfway back to her own office before I could respond. I hadn't told anyone I'd skipped lunch. I hadn't told anyone anything, not about lunch, not about much of anything in my life, not in 4 years. I made some joke about being too busy to eat, and she just looked at me for a second, longer than the moment strictly required, then walked away before I could ask how she'd known. It was Gwen Halliday, one of the younger engineers on my team, who finally said the thing out loud that I'd been too stubborn to consider. We were in the break room one afternoon, waiting on a pot of coffee that was taking its time, and Gwen leaned against the counter with the look of someone who'd been holding something back and had finally decided it wasn't worth holding anymore. "You know she fought to keep your line item off the cut list, right?" Gwen said, like it was common knowledge, like I was the only one in the building who hadn't heard. Back in February, when they were talking about trimming headcount on the Riverside job, she went to bat for you in that meeting. Practically got into it with Denny from finance over your salary line. I told her she must be mistaken. Elena Cross had never once, in 4 years, said a genuinely warm word to me in front of another human being, and I couldn't picture her going to bat for anyone, least of all me. Gwen just shrugged, the shrug of someone who'd learned not to argue with a man determined to misunderstand his own life, and went back to watching the coffee pot fill. I didn't believe her. Not really. Not yet. I told myself Gwen simply didn't have the full picture, that she was seeing kindness in something that was really just Elena protecting a project she'd already invested time in. It was a comfortable story, and I'd gotten good, over 4 years, at choosing the comfortable version over the true one. But I started noticing things I hadn't let myself notice before, small cracks in a story I'd told myself for years without ever questioning it. When Draymore's early audit team requested sample project files from every engineer on our floor, mine came back from Elena's desk, already flagged, and annotated in a way that made every decision I'd made look deliberate and defensible, rather than hurried and half-explained like most of our files actually looked. In meetings where other engineers got asked pointed questions about their judgment, I only ever got asked about my numbers, never once about my competence, as if someone in the room had already quietly decided which of those 2 things was actually in question. The way Elena's red folder, the one that traveled with her everywhere, the one the whole office treated like a loaded weapon left carelessly on a table, sometimes sat open on her desk with far more pages inside it than any simple punch list of my errors could ever require. Pages that looked, from the angle I caught them at through her open door, less like criticism and more like documentation, like evidence being carefully assembled and kept somewhere safe. I'd tell myself I was imagining it, that I was reading too much into a busy woman's messy desk, and go back to my own. There was a particular evening, rain just starting against the window glass, the kind of thin, cold rain that arrives before real autumn commits to showing up, when Elena stopped by my desk on her way out. She didn't say much. She never said much that wasn't directly about the work, but she stood there a moment longer than she needed to, folder pressed against her chest like something she was protecting from the weather, and said, "You're better than they're going to let you believe you are, Aaron." Then she left before I could ask what she meant. I sat with that sentence for a long time after the elevator doors closed behind her. I told myself it was nothing, a stray kindness, the kind of thing a decent boss says to keep a good employee from quitting during a stressful quarter full of layoffs and rumors. I didn't let myself consider, not seriously, not for longer than a few seconds at a time, that it might have been the truest thing anyone had said to me in 4 years, or that the woman who'd said it might have been carrying something far heavier than a folder full of red ink and margin notes. There was another night, close to the end of that stretch, when I caught her in the hallway outside the print room, holding a stack of my old Larkspur-era calculations that had nothing to do with any current project at Corliss. I asked her, half joking, why she was carrying around 10-year-old paperwork from a firm that didn't even exist anymore. She looked at the stack like she'd forgotten she was holding it, and said only, "Homework," before walking past me. I laughed it off. I didn't think to ask what kind of homework a director does on a Thursday night involving a bridge that had nothing to do with her job. Looking back now, from where I'm standing, I can see it so plainly it almost embarrasses me to admit how long it took. Every hard word had a soft reason sitting underneath it. Every late night had my name quietly attached to hers somewhere I couldn't see. She wasn't building a case against me the way I'd spent 4 years assuming. She was building one for me, in the only language she seemed to trust completely, which was proof, documented, and dated, and impossible to argue with later. But dramatic irony is a cruel thing to live inside of without knowing it, and I was living inside of it every single day, walking past the walls without ever once noticing they were even there. The transition committee held its first full review on a Tuesday, and I remember the exact date because it was the day my old life walked back into my new one wearing a Draymore lanyard around her neck like she'd never left corporate life a single day in her life. Vanessa, my ex-wife, came through the double doors of the conference room the way she'd always entered rooms, like the room itself was lucky to have her, which, honestly, wasn't a new performance for me to watch. She'd been introduced to the group as the new transition lead, brought in from Draymore's Chicago office specifically to help identify, in her own carefully rehearsed words, redundancies and risk exposure across the newly acquired Corliss teams. I hadn't known she was still in engineering administration. I hadn't known much of anything about her life since the divorce. And honestly, I'd preferred it that way for 4 years running. She found my eyes across the room within the first few seconds, and held them just long enough for me to understand this wasn't a coincidence, that whoever had assigned staff to the Corliss acquisition either hadn't known about our history or, worse, had known exactly and hadn't cared. 4 years of marriage, ended quietly, without children, without much drama on paper, and yet somehow here she was again, standing in front of a slide deck with my career sitting inside it like a line item to be resolved. What I hadn't expected, what none of us in that room had expected, was the man who walked in half a step behind her, adjusting his cufflinks like he had all the time in the world, Curtis Wilder. Now a vice president at Draymore, apparently, climbing steadily upward while my own career had spent a decade circling the drain he'd opened underneath me. 10 years earlier, he'd been the senior partner at Bramwell & Cole who pushed through the value engineering changes on the Larkspur Street pedestrian bridge over my written objection, changes that altered a connection detail I had specifically flagged in a memo dated months before that bridge ever failed its load test in front of half the city's inspectors. He'd signed off on those changes himself, quietly, over my name, and when the bridge cracked, when the whole project collapsed into headlines and formal investigations and a review board that wanted someone to blame quickly, it was my signature on the seal, and somehow, by the time the dust settled months later, it was only my name anyone in Philadelphia still remembered. I hadn't seen Curtis Wilder in 6 years. He looked directly at me across the conference table and gave me the kind of nod you give. A stranger you're pretending for the room's benefit. To barely recognize. He'd aged well. Better than a man who'd walked away clean from a bridge failure had any right to age. Gray at the temples now. A suit that fit like it had been chosen for him rather than bought off a rack. Nobody else in the room seemed to know our history. Only the three of us understood exactly what was sitting at that table alongside the usual quarterly numbers and headcount projections. Vanessa didn't waste any time getting to it. She pulled up a slide, and there it was, blown up on the screen behind her for everyone to study, the Larkspur Street Bridge, the crack running through the deck like a scar, None of us in that room had ever gotten a fair chance to properly explain. "I'm not being cruel, Aaron," she said, and her voice carried the same practiced warmth I remembered from years of watching her manage boardrooms exactly like this one. "I'm being efficient. Facts are facts. Your name, your seal, their bridge." Curtis leaned back in his chair, hands folded neatly in his lap, the picture of a reasonable man simply doing an unpleasant job that fell to him through no fault of his own. "Nobody's assigning blame here," he said, glancing around the table for agreement. "We're just managing risk." He said managing risk the exact same way he'd said it in 2019, right before he handed me the fall that ended one career and quietly launched another, and hearing those exact words come out of his mouth again, in a different city, a different room, 10 years later, felt like watching an old wound reopen on command with an audience watching. Someone from finance, a man I didn't recognize, asked reasonably enough whether there had ever been a formal finding of fault against me personally, as opposed to against the firm as a whole. Vanessa answered before anyone else in the room had a chance to. "The engineer of record bears responsibility for the seal," she said, like she was reciting a line she'd rehearsed in the car on the drive over. "That's not opinion. That's how the profession works." Nobody at the table disagreed with her, because on paper, in the narrowest possible reading of things, she wasn't entirely wrong. She just wasn't telling them the whole truth either. And sitting there listening to her, I was starting to understand that maybe she never had. I sat there and took it. Because what else was I going to do? Defend myself against a bridge that actually did crack, against a signature that actually was mine, without the one document that could have explained clearly why none of it should have landed only on me. I didn't have that document sitting in front of me, or at least I didn't think I did. I looked across the table at Elena. She hadn't said a single word through the entire presentation, hadn't moved except to breathe. Her hand rested on the red folder, fingers curled tightly around the strap, knuckles gone a little pale, like she was holding something back by sheer force of will. I watched her jaw tighten as Vanessa clicked forward to the next slide, watched her look down at that folder like it suddenly weighed far more than leather and paper had any right to weigh. But she didn't open it. She didn't say a single word in my defense. When the meeting finally ended, she gathered her things quickly and left the room without looking at me even once, and something in my chest went cold and quiet in a way I recognized from years before, the exact particular feeling of watching someone decide you weren't worth the trouble of saving after all. I told myself I understood completely. She had a career of her own to protect. She couldn't fight Draymore's own transition lead over one project engineer, with a well-documented, blemished history, not without a reason powerful enough to risk her own position, and clearly, sitting there in silence, she hadn't thought I was reason enough. I went home that night and sat in my kitchen without bothering to turn the lights on, still in my coat, replaying the phrase "your name, your seal, their bridge" on a loop until it lost all its meaning and dissolved into pure noise. I thought about Curtis Wilder's calm, folded hands. I thought about Vanessa's voice, still so smooth and rehearsed after everything that had happened between us. And I thought about Elena, quiet, folder pressed to her chest, walking out without a single word. And I told myself that whatever I'd quietly imagined building between us over the last several months had been exactly that. Imagined, and nothing more. I was wrong about almost everything that night. I just didn't have any way of knowing it yet. The knock came 4 days later, close to midnight. And that's where I started this story. Standing in my own doorway in yesterday's shirt with absolutely no idea what was coming down the walkway toward me. Elena didn't wait for an invitation. She stepped past me into the front hall like she'd made the decision to come inside long before she'd ever knocked, still in the same white shirt she'd worn to work that morning, sleeves pushed up like she'd come straight from somewhere she'd rather not name. Her car was parked at the curb, engine ticking as it cooled in the night air, and I remember thinking absurdly that I should have offered to take her coat before I remembered she wasn't wearing one. She walked into my kitchen the way she walked into a conference room, purposeful, unhurried, and set the red folder down on the table, like it had finally grown too heavy for her to keep carrying alone one more day. Then, for the first time in 4 years, she opened it in front of me completely. It wasn't a list of my errors. It never had been. Not once, not in all that time. Inside was a forensic engineering report dated 2020. Signed E. Cross, prepared for a firm called Corliss Group, in the weeks after Bramwell and Cole formally dissolved, back when Corliss had been hired to conduct an independent review of the Larkspur Street failure for the insurance carriers involved. Beneath it sat a memo, my memo, dated months before the bridge ever failed. The exact one where I'd objected in writing, formally, to the structural change Curtis Wilder pushed through anyway without telling me. I hadn't known that memo survived the collapse of the firm. I certainly hadn't known it had ended up, years later, in the hands of a 29-year-old forensic engineer named Elena Cross, who read every line of it, understood immediately and completely what it meant, and buried nothing, even though the firm that could have used it to formally clear my name no longer existed to do so on my behalf. I told myself I came here tonight to warn you, she said, and her voice was quieter than I'd ever once heard it in 4 years. None of the courtroom edge from the conference room earlier that week, none of the red ink precision from years of Tuesday reviews. That's true. She paused, and I watched her visibly decide whether to say the next part out loud. It's just not the only true thing. I looked down at the drafts underneath the memo, dated across years. Every single one, a version of my own work that she had personally revised, tightened, quietly defended. Every single time headcount cuts came up at Corliss. 3 separate rounds of layoffs over 4 years. And my name never once made the final list. And now, standing in my kitchen at midnight, I understood exactly why that was. You've been protecting me for 4 years, I said, and my voice didn't sound entirely like mine anymore, and letting me hate you for it the whole time. It was easier, she said softly, than letting them see what you were to me. Neither of us said anything for a long moment after that. The porch light buzzed faintly through the front window behind her. I thought about every red mark on every drawing, every night she'd stayed late for no stated reason at all, the sandwich left silently on my desk without a word of explanation. And I understood, all at once, standing there in my own kitchen, that I had spent 4 straight years reading one woman's quiet devotion as punishment, simply because I hadn't believed, deep down, that I deserved anything gentler than that from anyone. She told me there was one more piece still sitting in that folder. A man named Dale Brenner, an engineer who'd worked directly under Curtis at Bramwell and Cole, who'd seen the override happen firsthand with his own eyes and had never said a single word about it publicly, out of fear for his own career and his own family. Elena had found him during the original forensic review, 6 years earlier, and had kept his statement on file, unused, patiently, because without me willing to stand up and be named openly in the room, his testimony alone would go absolutely nowhere against a man like Curtis Wilder. He'll talk, she said, watching my face carefully. If you're ready for people to finally hear it? I asked her why now, why tonight, after 4 years of silence, after watching me sit through that conference room without saying a single word in my defense. She told me she'd almost opened the folder that same afternoon, right there at the table, in front of Vanessa and Curtis and the entire committee, and had stopped herself only because she knew what it would look like. A director defending one employee too personally, too publicly, in a room already primed to read everything about me with suspicion. She'd needed to bring it to me first, privately, and let the decision to go public belong to me rather than to her. It wasn't caution for her own sake, she said. It was caution for mine. I stood in my own kitchen with the porch light humming faintly behind us both and understood, clearly, for the first time, that this wasn't a decision Elena Cross could make for me, no matter how many quiet years she'd already spent making every other decision that had somehow kept me employed and protected without my knowledge. This one had to be entirely mine to make. I looked down at the memo, at my own handwriting from 10 years earlier, the proof I'd genuinely given up, believing still existed anywhere in the world. And for the first time since Larkspur Street ever failed, I said yes to something out loud. Clearly, without hesitation. The next transition committee meeting was nothing at all like the first one had been. Dale Brenner sat 2 seats down from me and told the entire room, in plain, unhurried, deliberate language, exactly what he'd personally watched Curtis Wilder do back in 2019, how the connection detail had been changed against a formal written objection, how that objection had been quietly buried the moment the firm folded, rather than properly investigated by anyone with the authority to act on it. Elena presented the forensic report alongside his statement, the one carrying her own signature at the bottom, dated 2020, sealed and complete, and until that very morning, sitting quietly inside a red folder that nobody outside that room had ever once been allowed to see in full. Vanessa's face didn't move through most of it, though I noticed her hands had gone completely still on the table in a way they hadn't been during her own confident presentation just days earlier. Curtis tried to speak twice during Dale's account, and was asked, both times, calmly but firmly, to let the committee finish reviewing the documents before he offered any further commentary of his own. I spoke too, briefly, near the end, not to defend myself so much as to finally say out loud what I'd carried silently for a decade. I told them about the memo, about writing it in good faith, and watching it disappear along with the firm that should have kept it on file. I told them I'd spent 10 years assuming the world had simply decided who I was based on one bridge, and that I'd more or less agreed with that verdict myself, right up until a woman I'd spent 4 years misunderstanding decided I was worth fighting for anyway. Nobody in that room said anything for a moment after I finished. Even Curtis, for once, had nothing ready to say. The vote came back 6-1, in favor of formally reopening the Larkspur Street findings, clearing my name entirely from the original failure report, and opening a full formal review of Curtis Wilder's conduct across his time at both firms. Vanessa's role on the transition team quietly ended within the month that followed, and she left Corliss the same way she'd arrived, briskly, without a goodbye to anyone, off toward whatever room somewhere else still needed managing next. I heard later, secondhand, through people who still talked to people at Draymore, that Curtis was asked to step down from his position before the review even concluded, which didn't surprise me. Some men only ever manage risk right up until the risk finally catches up with them. I won't pretend I felt triumphant walking out of that building. Mostly I felt tired. The particular exhaustion of setting down something heavy you've been carrying so long you'd forgotten it even had a weight at all. Elena found me in the parking lot afterward, leaning against my car, not saying much of anything, and she didn't say much either. She just stood next to me for a while in the cold evening air, and somehow that was enough for both of us. I won't pretend the year that followed was dramatic in any way. It really wasn't. It was quiet. In the very best way quiet can be after years of being loud with worry. I was reinstated as design lead on 2 separate projects that spring. The first time in a full decade that anyone had trusted my seal on something that genuinely mattered to a client. Elena and I didn't fall into anything sudden or rushed. We took it slowly, deliberately, the way 2 people do when they've spent years mistaking real closeness for conflict and aren't in any particular hurry to get something this important wrong a second time. Coffee after work turned gradually into dinner. Dinner eventually turned into quiet evenings that weren't about deadlines or transition reviews at all anymore. We started small. A walk along the river after a long Friday, the 2 of us not talking about work for the first time in years. A movie neither of us really watched, more interested in the conversation happening quietly underneath it. Her showing up, unannounced, with takeout the week my mother was sick, sitting with me at my own kitchen table without needing to fill the silence with anything at all. I found myself for the first time in years looking forward to Mondays, not because of the work waiting for me on my desk, but because of who I knew I'd be sitting across from during morning review. Gwen noticed, before either of us said anything official about it, the way people at the office always seem to notice these things before you're ready for them to be noticed. She caught me smiling at my phone one afternoon and just said, finally, like she'd been waiting years for permission to say it out loud. I didn't bother denying it. There wasn't much point anymore. And honestly, I didn't want there to be. Elena told me, months into it, on a night we weren't talking about work at all, that she'd read my personnel file for the first time back in 2020, during the original forensic review, long before she ever transferred to Corliss or became my director. She said she'd requested the transfer herself the following year, quietly, once she learned there was an opening on the team I'd landed on. I asked her, that night, why she'd never simply told me any of it sooner. Why she'd chosen 4 long years of red ink over one honest conversation. She said, quietly, that she hadn't trusted herself to be fair to me as a director if she let herself be honest about anything else first. It made a strange kind of sense, the more I sat with it, turning it over the way I used to turn over her sentence about the axe and the shield. She'd protected the truth about Larkspur Street by burying it inside a version of herself that could stand to watch me suffer a little longer, so long as she made certain I never actually fell. A year later, almost to the exact week, the same red folder sat open on my desk again, no longer something the whole office quietly feared, just a folder now, worn soft at the corners, holding a set of drawings with both our names printed together on the title block for the very first time. Still want me to do it again? Elena asked, nodding at the latest markup, a small, genuine smile at the corner of her mouth that I had finally, patiently learned to read correctly after everything we'd both been through to get here. "Only if you stay while I do," I told her, meaning every single word of it, and she did. "I used to believe the person hardest on you was always the person who trusted you the least. I know now that isn't always true. Sometimes the person tearing your work apart in front of a room full of people is the exact same person quietly making sure, in every place you can't see, that nobody ever gets the chance to take your name away from you a second time." She never opened that red folder at my door the night she finally showed up. She just stood there and held it out first, quietly, and let me decide for myself whether I actually wanted to know what was inside it. And I finally understood, standing there in my own kitchen, that it had never once been a weapon. It was 4 straight years of one woman quietly making certain that if the worst ever came looking for me again, the truth would already be sitting there, ready, written in her own steady handwriting. The woman who humiliated me in every single meeting turned out to be the only person who never once let me fall. So here's what I keep asking myself, quietly, late at night sometimes, and what I genuinely want to ask you tonight too. If someone was hard on you for years, would you have the patience to eventually wonder why? Or would you walk away long before you ever found out exactly what they were quietly protecting? And between the person who says the truth out loud just to hurt you, and the person who hides it quietly just to save you, who would you actually choose to trust? If this story moved you tonight, hit like, subscribe for more stories like this one, and tell me down in the comments, would you have opened that door? I read every single one of them.